Okay, well, I think we can begin. So I'll start with a call to order and at, what time is it? It's like 6:05, and I'll do a roll call. Leslie?
Present.
Niall?
Yes.
Steve?
Present.
Mitchell?
Present.
David?
Present.
Darian?
Present.
And I am present, so there are nobody's absent. That's fantastic. And with that, I'll move over to an approval of the agenda. Can I get a motion to approve the agenda?
Motion to approve.
Can I get a second?
I'll second.
Okay, so first by Darian, second by Leslie. Anybody opposed? Okay, so approved. And then we'll move into brief announcements from staff.
Good evening, Commissioners. I have a real quick announcement, more so a reminder to all of you. Our City Clerk's office sent out an email asking some of you, maybe all of you, to confirm if you would like to reapply for the following term for the Fiscal Commission, to be on Fiscal Commission. And the deadline is April 18th. So if you haven't done so already, please make sure and remember to do that. Thank you. That's all.
Are there any brief announcements from commissioners? No. Okay, and the city council liaison?
I don't have any. Thank you, though.
Okay, well then, I think we can move into public comment. So anyone who's here for in-person public comment, please step forward.
And there's a public comments on the items not on the agenda.
For items not on the agenda.
Good evening, Matt Williams. Each of you have received 2 emails from me which I directed to Councilmember Neville and to our Public Information Officer, Jenny Tan, so that they will be handled as public information requests. We now are 6 months since or 5 months since the election. The 2021 audit was promised by that. Things have happened that have caused that promise to be looked at with 2020 hindsight as over-optimistic. But the reality is that we don't have a 2021 audit. We don't have a 2022 audit. We don't have a 2023 audit. And in January, the customary month for issuing the 2024 audit has come and gone. So we are now over 3 years behind in terms of our audited financial statements. There are federal and state laws that not issuing your audited financial statements have consequences, and nothing has been told to the citizens as to why this is happening. We don't know what are the objections that the auditors are coming up with, the specific objections. Those concerns should be shared publicly to all of the taxpayers so that people understand that the City of Davis' finances are being handled in an above-board way. We've just read in the Sacramento Bee that the city manager of Sacramento was putting expenses onto the city expense roll, personal expenses. We have the city of Bell that had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars that were improperly handled. The whole purpose of audited financial statements is to transparently and honestly tell the people who are paying for and living in the jurisdiction how the city is handling its finances. You all are our watchdog. You all should be on top of this. Councilmember Neville, when she was sitting in your seats on the Finance and Budget Commission, raised this issue. I raised this issue. Dan Carson, when he was on the Finance and Budget Commission, raised this issue. about audited financial statements. It is a horrible message, the silence that we are all seeing. I hope you all will ask for the silence to end. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ward. Is there anyone else for in-person public comment? Is there any written or recorded public comment?
Not for this particular item.
Okay, well then, with that, we'll move on to item number 5, the meeting minutes, from the approval for the meeting minutes of March 5th. Can I get a motion to approve?
A motion to approve?
Okay, first by Mitchell. Can I get a second? Second by Leslie. Anyone opposed? Do you have any, or any edits, or?
Well, I have comments.
Oh, comments.
Yeah. So this is on the consent item, right?
Yes.
So, so I do have comments on the minutes, and the comments are positive because what I saw with the minutes, I'm not sure who took them, whether it was you, Louis, or what have you, but I appreciated having the questions that were asked by the commissioners included under the agenda items, which hasn't been done in the past or at least not in the recent past. And the reason that I favor that is that I want others to see if they also concur. The reason that I favor that is that it's more helpful when these minutes are passed on, assuming the council reads them, to actually see the kind of thinking and analysis that we have relating to it. So these are some good questions, I think, or at least better than average questions. So I approve of that. So thank you for doing that. And then the other piece of the story, which I'm not necessarily advocating for, but the next step could have been to actually have answers to those, because there were answers that were provided by the consultants and city staff at the meeting. Now that may make the notes too voluminous, I understand that. So but I'm happy that those were included, and I would suggest that be the process, the questions be the process in the future if that's possible.
Yeah, I think that was your suggestion 2 meetings ago, so it was a good suggestion. I think that we can still move forward with the approval as it was put forward. So first by Mitchell, second by Leslie. And anyone opposed? None. With that, we'll move to approve, and we'll move into item 6 on the regular agenda. So the first item would be Village Farms Davis Development Project Fiscal Overview and Commitments.
All right, Commissioners, I'll start up the item. This item in front of you, you will receive the project overview and the fiscal analysis presentation from our consultant, who would like to obviously solicit public comment and get your feedback on the fiscal analysis that is proposed or presented in front of you. There are a couple of things we're looking at as part of the fiscal analysis for you to look at the assumptions and tell us if you agree with the assumptions that were used in order to derive with projections that are put in front of you. And there's also a request to look at potential funding mechanisms for certain open space and natural habitat areas. So with that, I will hand it over to Dara Dunsworth. She's the principal planner with the Community Development Department. She will give you a little bit of an overview and then pass it on to Matt.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Good evening, Commissioners. Dara Dunworth, Principal Planner, Community Development Department. We're here this evening to present the Village Farms Davis project to this commission for your consideration. The Village Farms project is a proposed 498-acre neighborhood in North Davis. proposing approximately 1,800 dwelling units comprised of attached and detached market rate and deed restricted affordable houses. The proposal also includes a community park, a neighborhood park, a natural habitat area, an educational farm, a pre-K daycare, a fire station, green belts, and an urban agricultural transition area, which you will see referenced as the UATA. The project has been processing for almost 2 years now, and I would just like to note that through the course of the environmental review and analysis that has been taking place for at least the last 12 months, the originally proposed project has been modified in response to findings through that environmental analysis. And so the proposed project is now referred to as the Biological Resource Preservation Alternative, or the BRPA, and it is designed to exclude the designated wetland area described as a playa habitat, which is the 47.1 acre natural habitat area that you can see here on this map. It's the green area in the middle of the project site. This is the project that the applicant has asked the city to continue to process, and so this is the project that will be brought forward through the other commissions and eventually Planning Commission and City Council, and to the voters if City Council forwards the project onto the ballot. Several discretionary approvals are required. They include a general plan amendment, a preliminary planned development or pre-zoning. Those are the land use components of what is proposed for the project, and a development agreement. Development agreement is essentially a contract between the city and the developer that locks in certain elements and features, things like funding and timing mechanisms, such things like that. Additionally, should City Council refer the project to the ballot and to the voters, additional actions would be needed by the city. So we're not done, although at this juncture, this would be the first and only time that the project comes before this commission for consideration. Future actions by the city include implementing entitlements such as tentative subdivision maps, final plan developments, which are again the zoning, and a site plan or design review approvals are required prior to actual construction, whether it's the backbone infrastructure, roads, utilities, things like that, or before actual building permits are pulled for residences, multifamily, or any other site or commercial structures that are going to come forward. There are a couple of things that need to be processed through the county. They include a sphere of influence amendment, as well as an annexation of the site. As I noted, the application has been and will continue to be reviewed by staff. Review and recommendations from the commissions, such as yourselves, will help inform these final last months of staff's review and help guide the applicant in finalizing specific project details ahead of going to Planning Commission and onto City Council. Also, by way of an update, the environmental impact report process is continuing, and we are in the very last few days of wrapping up responses to comments, and the final EIR is anticipated to be released to the public in May at this time. I won't go into too many of the rest of the details in the staff report that you have. I did mention some of the future approval requirements. There's more detail with those in attachment 1 that I would call your attention to. I can briefly provide some updates from the 3 previous commissions that we've been to so far. The first one was Recreation and Parks. We did provide a brief summary of their 7-point recommendation. Additionally, we were just at Climate and Environmental Justice on Monday, so we didn't have the outcome of that yet. Very briefly, and that summary will be coming forward, as well as official minutes will be presented to that commission at their next regular meeting. Climate and Environmental Justice was focused on the trees and the tree removal. There was some information that was amended at that meeting with respect to the numbers of trees the project is proposing to remove. They also expressed concern that current standards and codes in effect at the time of the future entitlements would be applied to the project, which is fairly typical unless something other than that has been negotiated and agreed to in the development agreement. So fairly standard operating procedure. And then finally, one of their other main points was that the habitat resource area, the 47.1 acre, remain in permanent protection, which is also required by other regulations, state and federal regulations. So with that, I will turn to this commission, and as Elena mentioned, this commission is being asked to review the fiscal impact analysis and its assumptions and provide feedback. We will bring that feedback forward, again, as I said, to Planning Commission and on to City Council as we continue to process the project. With that, I would like to turn it over to our subject matter expert, our consultant Matt Cauda from BAE, and he does have a slide presentation, so if you would bear with me for just one moment, I will tee this up for him and you. Oh, that's not what I want. Sorry, I can't talk and mouse at the same time. So with that, here's Matt. Thank you.
Thank you, Dara. Good evening, Madam Chair, members of the Commission. Again, Matt Cota with BAE Urban Economics. I'm the managing principal of the firm. Actually live here in Davis and have worked with the city on many different fiscal analyses over the years. This one, as we all know, is about the Village Farms project, and it is focusing on that VRPA alternative. Just a kind of high level, what does the fiscal impact analysis look at? It's considering the fiscal impacts to the City of Davis General Fund for ongoing provision of municipal services. So we're not getting into accounting for how one-time capital costs are covered, so things like building roads, building out parks. There's a proposed fire station as part of this project. Those one-time development costs are not included. They're assumed to be funded by other mechanisms such as contributions to the development agreement, impact fees, and other one-time revenue sources. Also does not address costs or revenues associated with the city's various enterprise funds, so things like the water and wastewater utilities that are funded by the user fees. It is an adaptation of the City of Davis fiscal model, which has been used over many years for different projects and has been updated and tweaked and refined and so forth. Folks that have seen some of the other ones for projects such as Bretton Woods or Nishi, some of the other earlier projects would recognize the format of the model. So the analysis period, we're estimating a roughly 15-year build-out period for the project. The year one dollar figures are based on the 2025 mid-cycle budget update figures, and then subsequent years cost and revenue projections are inflated based on some of the key assumptions that I'll get to in just a few minutes. The fiscal model is intended to illustrate how the project's costs and revenue impacts would ramp up over time as the project builds out and we get out to that final year when everything is absorbed and you can see the full burden of costs for services and also the full revenue generation that we expect from the project. Some of the key assumptions that apply throughout the model include inflation rates. And for the general rate of inflation, for non-personnel costs, real estate valuation, we're assuming an average long-term 2.5% annual increase. For personnel costs, we've plugged in a 4% annual average. This is based on discussions with the finance department. And it is recognizing that over the next 15 or so years, the city's expecting to have some additional above general inflation rates of increase in personnel costs for certain components of the benefits and the compensation and so forth for employees. For population and employment density, so the factors we use to estimate the new residents, the new employees that would be on site based on the development program. We're looking at current American Community Survey data for the city of Davis for single-family homes, for the residential, medium, and low density, for multifamily units, for the apartment component of the project. You can see 2.72 per household. For the residential, medium, and low, 2.1 persons per household for the apartments. For the retail component, there's a small neighborhood retail services component of the project. We have kind of a standard assumption of 500 square feet per employee. And then for the pre-K early learning center, we're assuming that that's a little bit less intensive on the employment, about 1,000 square feet per employee, which is consistent with assumptions we use for other kinds of institutional type employment settings. Service cost variability is a concept of how much of the existing service costs do we think are going to increase in response to increased demand within the city for services. And in keeping with prior fiscal analyses, I think at least the last several that the city has done, we've utilized a 75% variability factor. So that's assuming that if a department is spending $4 million a year on services, that about $3 million of that is variable in responding to new development, and that's going to drive our cost increases when we're using average cost multipliers. And I'll talk a little bit about different projection techniques in a moment. For property valuation assumptions, this is pretty important. Property tax as well as other property-related revenues will account for a significant portion of the new revenues this project will generate. And that's driven by the initial valuation of those development components. So for the low-density residential, which is kind of standard to larger lot, single-family detached homes, we're expecting them to come in around 1.3 million on average per unit. For the medium density residential, which would be more of a small lot type of product, 3,500 to 5,500 square foot lots, we're plugging in an average of 740,000 per unit. And then for the, I shouldn't have said non-residential, for market rate, but market rate apartments, we're assuming 400,000 a unit valuation for those. For the retail, about $400 a square foot. And then the pre-K early learning center, the educational farm, and the affordable apartments, those are all assumed to be tax exempt from property taxes. For property tax allocation, this is an important assumption in the model. We don't know exactly how this will turn out. The city and county will have to negotiate a revenue sharing agreement that would determine if this project moves forward, how the property taxes would be reallocated. So this is an area that's not incorporated, so the city receives no property tax from property in this area right now. The county does, and there's a share that goes to the county. It's currently just under 22% of the 1% ad valorem. In keeping with more recent negotiations that were successful between the county and the city for other development projects, we've assumed for this analysis as a starting point a 50-50 reallocation. So the city would get about 11% of that 1% ad valorem in this area per these assumptions. For absorption, again, I mentioned about a 15-year absorption period for the whole project to build out is what we're assuming. The phase 1 development would be roughly from years 1 through 8, and then phase 2, 3, and 4 would be in years 9 through 15. So the project is kind of front-loaded with more of its development in phase 1 as a proportion of the total. So you see about half of that occurring in the first phase, and then the other half occurring in the later 3 phases. For the non-residential development, We don't know exactly when that would come online, but we have made an assumption that it wouldn't happen until the second phase, so year 9 of the project. The pre-K early learning center, we assume, comes in a little bit earlier in the first phase. And the fire station, based on discussions with city staff, it should come in somewhere between year 3 and 5, so we picked the middle of that, year 4. For the publicly maintained streets, parks, and open space, we are generally pacing that absorption out with the pace of the residential development, since that's going to drive the need for the associated infrastructure, amenities, and so forth. A little bit more about the projection techniques. So there's 2 main techniques for projecting costs and revenues in a model like this. The first one is the average cost or revenue multiplier approach, where we're looking at the current average cost of service and we break it down on a per dwelling unit equivalent basis, where we're considering both residents and employees within businesses within the city, and calculate an average cost for your existing services and your existing development. And then assuming that moving forward that those kinds of costs will increase in more or less straight line as your population employment within the project increases and contributes to that overall increase in the citywide number of dwelling unit equivalents. This is also incorporates that 75% service cost variability factor. So that's kind of a modification to just a pure straight line approach. The other way is a case study approach, where we're specifically identifying either revenue generating potential or service demand associated with the project, and then identifying the specific costs associated with that. Best example I can give you would be for the roadway maintenance functions and for the operation of the new fire station, where we know that there's a proposal for a new fire station. We can cost that out in terms of the cost of staffing, personnel costs, which is the major piece, but also some station operation and maintenance, upkeep type expenditures. And then for the roadway maintenance, we can look at the number of lane miles of roads that would be built within the project and apply a current average cost per lane mile for maintenance. So we do that where we can get down to some specifics about exactly what service responsibilities the city would be taking on. We also know, for example, the number of new park acres, and we can apply a per acre park maintenance cost to that. And then similarly, on the revenue side, we have very much a case study approach to projecting what the property tax revenue is based on those property tax allocation factors, the assessed valuations, the number of units and type of units, and so forth. So both techniques are incorporated into the model, and we talk a little bit more about the specifics of those in the memo that's attached to your staff report this evening. But to kind of get to the bottom line here, we had 3 different ways that we allocated the cost of the fire station. That's, in my mind, a real big variable in the potential fiscal picture for this project. So holding everything else the same across 3 different scenarios, we have tables 1A, 1B, and 1C included in the fiscal model in the memo attached to the report. 1A summarizes this first bullet, the project, with 100% fire station cost allocation. So we burden the Village Farms project with all of the cost of this new fire station. We get a significant annual and cumulative fiscal deficit scenario for the project. So it's not capable on its own of supporting all the costs of a new fire station, which we're estimating would be about $3.4 million per year in operating costs. We also looked at these other alternatives where it's only allocated a share of the cost of the fire station. And this is based on a recognition that for a number of years, certain parts of North Davis have been identified as being outside of the targeted 5-minute emergency response time for the fire department, and therefore a need has existed even prior to Village Farms for potentially another fire station to solve that response time issue for those areas that have the longer than targeted response times. So the first alternative, 1B, was to say, what if we look at all of the existing development in the city, plus Village Farms, we add the cost of the 4th fire station to the existing cost of the fire department. So we get a system, sorry about that, we get a system-wide cost with the new fire station, and we allocate that cost out pro rata to all the development within the city, including Village Farms, and Village Farms share ends up being about 1/3 of the total cost of the fire station. And equivalent to that. So that one then, of course, makes the fiscal picture look much better, and we get to around a break-even result on the net fiscal impacts of the project over time. We also looked at a third scenario that kind of bookended to a more aggressive allocation of cost to development throughout the city. And we looked at not just existing development plus Village Farms, but we also added in a factor for other future growth within the city of Davis that added some additional units to help spread that fire system cost out. It didn't really move the needle significantly because it wasn't adding that many additional units to the pool relative to the existing base relative to Village Farms. So I would still say, given the margin of error for this kind of analysis, that it's still around the sort of break-even on a cumulative basis. So with that, I'll go ahead and wrap up my remarks. Happy to have city staff comment further or to answer questions at your pleasure.
Does anyone else have, does city staff have any other items to add to this? Okay. I think, should we do discussion or open it up to public comment? Just a point of clarification.
Public comments first, if you would.
Okay, I think I will open up to public comments first. So if anyone wants to comment on this item in person, please move forward.
2 minutes?
Sure. Well, I've been doing 3, so.
Fair enough. I'm former Davis City Council member Dan Carson. I sat in that chair right over there for the better part of 9 years, half of that time on this commission and half of that time on council. And so it's great to be back here. I have very much an interest in the fire station issue, and I sent you this afternoon an email making the point that there's good analytical work that's been done here by Mr. Cota. I've worked with him many times. But there is another way of looking at the fire station issue, which is to look back at the question of, do we need to build a 4th fire station at all? And in 2018, we received a consultant report the council did from one of the foremost consultants that looks at fire protection issues in the country. And his response to us was, you don't need to build a 4th one. What you might need to do and consider doing is repositioning your stations so that way you have a one-time capital outlay cost for accomplishing that kind of a change, but you don't have an ongoing growing operating cost for the rest of your life for that additional 4th station and its staff. They get pay raises, they get benefit increases. You cap your cost, and so you could do that, and you can take whatever position you want on looking at the 3 alternatives that Mr. Cota has given you, but I'm suggesting that in addition to whatever decision you reach about that you further urge the council to reopen the issue about a program that would move 1 or 2 stations and hopefully get resources from this project, both in terms of one-time resources perhaps in ongoing resources to help accomplish this change, and that would still provide a good fire protection to the people living at Village Farm someday, but without creating a very significant fiscal challenge for the city. That 3.4 million, another way to think about it, is the equivalent of about 1/3 of the Measure Q dollars that the voters just authorized. And that's going to start in 4 years. You know, I think there's a better way to approach this. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Person.
Good evening, everybody. Matt Best, Superintendent, Davis-Joy Unified School District. First, thank you for your public service. Not an easy time to be a public servant, but appreciate your work. I think anytime we're talking about housing in Davis, we need to think about it in the context of the broader community, which includes our schools. Last night, we did a presentation to the council describing what we're on the precipice of at Davis-Joy Unified. We are projected to lose about 100 students per year for the next decade should there not be new housing in Davis. What that means is without new housing in Davis, we will see a structural change in our school district that will include school closure, consolidation, school model changes, and reboundarying. While I always want public servants to do their due diligence, I want you to do that within the context of that we need more housing in Davis to sustain the excellent academic programming that many of you have experienced, your children, my children, all value. So thank you for your service and good luck.
Matt Williams, former member of your commission. You've got a lot of alumni here today. Matt Cowda always does a great job in his analyses, but there are some things that are really seriously missing in what's here. Many of you are familiar with strong towns, and I'm going to read a quote from Strong Towns. In each of these, the local unit of government benefits immediately from all the permit fees, utility charges, and increased tax collection. This is real money that provides revenue for the current budget. The model had all of that in it. Cities also assume the long-term capital infrastructure maintenance liability for servicing and maintaining all the new infrastructure, a promise that won't come due fully for decades. This exchange, a near-term cash advantage for a long-term financial obligation, is one element of a Ponzi scheme. Nowhere in the numbers that you see here is the replacement cost at the end of useful life for the roads or any of the other capital infrastructure. So what we are going to be doing is taking on that liability as citizens, as taxpayers, and most importantly, our children are taking it on as a big, huge bubble. It's like a balloon mortgage. There's the balloon out there, and I strongly believe that the balloon should be in the model that Mr. Cowda has put together. The other thing that I'd like to see, following up on what Dan Carson said, is I'd like to see a graph from the 100% down to the 30% as to where, at the various percentages along the way, where does this project actually make money for the city in that short term? With the bubble, with the long-term liability, it won't ever get there. But even with Matt's numbers, I'd like to see what happens when you bring the cost down, because it's a whole lot cheaper, as Dan said, to put an ambulance in the parking lot at the Big Nugget to be able to do the over 80% of the calls that come in that are for medical as opposed to for fire. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have some handouts.
Good evening, Eileen Sametz. I'm a former planning commissioner. I worked on the general plan update and the housing element steering committee. That was after that. I'll start with the fire station issue because I'm totally against having another fire station. It doesn't make any sense. And we talked about this during the general plan update. And let me tell you why. Because at that time, we got information from the fire department. We also got input from the police station about what the statistics were. It was like 90% of the calls from the fire department are medical. They're not fire related. And that has not changed much. Because we would be reading about it in the newspaper, right? You'd be hearing about how many fires have we read about? You can count probably on one hand. So the point is, the solution is an EMS service, which would be a fraction of the cost. It could be located almost anywhere in East Davis, and would have a much smaller footprint. You just need like what the 2 ambulances, and then wherever it could go, it would not necessarily be hamstrung here. The other problem is, how would you get a fire truck onto Cobell when it's congested 90% of the time? A 4 or 5 minute response time means nothing if the truck can't get out onto Cobell Boulevard. And then think about how would it go east? How would it get across Cobell Boulevard to go east? So it makes no sense to get, and $3.4 million per year is what it would cost just for operational costs. It makes no sense. So for a fraction of the cost, we would get what we need, which is the medical services. You don't need a fire truck to start someone's heart, you need ambulances. Anyway, the other thing about Village Farms, the project continues to have the same problems it did when it was proposed as Cobell Village and its predecessor. So the problem is it has a seriously flawed and handicapped parcel because it's got a 200-acre floodplain. It's directly adjacent to the old unlined city landfill and sewage treatment plant, which is now in the EIR. They found out that there's PFASs, which are carcinogenic in the groundwater. But not only that, the fact that there are soil toxics as well, serious soil toxics. There's toxaphene, which is a carcinogen and also neurotoxin, as well as lead in high levels where they want to put the park. And then there's very high levels of arsenic where the UATA, which is the urban ag transition area, that they want to use as fill. Now that high arsenic fill, they want to use for the 200-acre floodplain. So the reason I bring this up is because these are liability issues that are not addressed in this report. So think about the years of litigation and of what the city would be susceptible to by allowing this project to go forward in the form that it is now, when what's been recommended is why not downsize it, get it away from the landfill and all that. And is that for me? Okay. Anyway, get it away from the landfill and the floodplain that's all in the north, downsize it just below the channel, and then downsize the size of the projects a little bit as well in terms of number of units. But you still get a project that does not have all these problems and costs. Because the other thing is they have to relocate the channel. If y'all wrap up, the channel they have to relocate, that's going to impose more costs because they have to rip up streets like Sycamore and all these other streets as well. So all these costs, all this has not been addressed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Are there any other in-person public comments? Anything recorded or written? Recorded?
We have received 2 written public comments via email that all of you received. Actually, one of them was from one of the public commenters here, and one was, I'm going to say, an anonymous sender because it did not have a name. You all should have received it in your emails, and we acknowledge the receipt.
Thank you. Well, if there aren't any more other comments, then I think I'll just open it up to clarifying questions up here. Anybody have a clarifying question?
I have some, but
Okay, why don't I,
we'll just go, yeah.
I'll just start at this end, I guess you want to go first.
Thank you so much. I was wondering, because I saw that it showed that the breakdown of the units between single family and duplexes and and I can't remember what the other categories were, but I was just wondering like what percent, if we have the information of what percentage of the housing is duplexes versus single family.
I don't think the applicant has gotten quite to that level of detail, but that would be something that they would be prepared to address when you're ready to have them answer questions.
And I think this kind of goes along with that. I was just wondering if this mirrors the general density of the rest of the city, or if it's greater or less than, which again, may be something that will be better answered once they give more information.
The land uses proposed are consistent with other land use designations for residential and within the city. There's low, medium, and high residential uses, and so those densities will be consistent with those of the general plan.
Okay, and I was just curious if, like, given that currently I don't know, say more.
Sorry.
You're welcome, go ahead.
The applicant is sharing that the duplexes are 10%.
Well, and my follow-up question was, I was wondering if given, we've raised taxes, Mr. Q, and I think about 25% of our revenue is coming from property taxes, and it looks like even the more optimistic projections are this is going to be about break even. If there's concern that we're not using our resources, being good stewards of the city resources by making a development that's just going to break even and not add to our revenue stream.
I'll take a stab at that, and then if Elaine or anyone else wants to jump in. Typically, residential uses are not moneymakers. They aren't job centers. They don't they don't provide a revenue stream. So actually break even for a project of this type is pretty good. There is a small commercial component, which Matt's analysis does include. So it's really whether you believe the assumptions are where they should be. But in terms of just generally speaking, this is probably on par for most projects of this type and these types of land use mixes.
And then I think it's my last question, but I was also wondering about, I saw that SACOG had identified that for our housing needs in this metropolitan area, we need about 40% affordable housing. And I wanted to confirm that this project is about 20% affordable housing, and considerations given to meeting the need for the affordable housing in this metro area.
The applicant is working with staff right now on their affordable housing plan, and they do intend to comply with the city's ordinance for very low and low rental units. They also have some other ideas around other types of attainable housing. So again, they are intending to comply with city code for affordable housing.
Just a quick reminder to the commission, so the focus of the fiscal commission is to stay on a fiscal analysis. Some of the questions that are being raised right now are not necessarily fiscal commission pointed, I guess, question, or not the fiscal analysis. So I just want to make sure that we'll focus on the on that and not on the necessarily, in some cases, policy as to other commissions would normally address.
And I guess the density component, that feeds into the assumptions around like break even and that sort of thing, right?
The density component relates to the pricing assumptions that we made for the residential unit types, specifically the for sale, single family, low, medium. So the higher the density, the smaller the lot sizes on average, vice versa. So we considered what those densities would be and the typical lot sizes associated with them, and then that was taken into consideration as part of setting our assumptions for the valuation for the for sale housing units.
have another follow-up question, Mitchell?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Gary, do you have any questions?
Sure. Can you hear me okay? Great work, super interesting. I have a question.
My main question is about the 11%, because that seems to be the really big problem here, is that post-Prop 13 residential units don't pay for themselves, especially because the city itself doesn't get an anemic amount of the property tax, and apparently so does the county. But what I don't understand is in the unincorporated area, if the county gets 20% of the 1%, I understand the county can only agree to give us some of theirs, and so they agree to give us half. That's something that is so low. Who gets the other 80%? And to the extent that this development is going to lead to a dramatic increase in property values in that area, why can't we get some percentage from all the other entities that are in that area? Because I think that changes all the numbers.
Yeah, it's certainly a challenge. 20%, 22% is not a huge amount for the county to have. Of course, they're not collecting revenue on a developed property, so there's not a lot of service demand there either. However, that number is certainly something that it can vary, right, depending on the negotiation. How does that piece get split up? But that doesn't help. It's a zero-sum game. The more the city gets, the less the county gets. Your question about, well, where's the rest of that going? So large percentages will go to entities such as school districts.
Is it the Davis Joint Unified School District out there?
Yes, yes. I believe this area is included in DJUSD, so they need their share in order to provide their services. There's a community college district. There's a whole host of other entities that all would argue they will have to provide services to the development in this area as well. So typically their revenues are not up for negotiation or reallocation. We just look at how we split that up.
Okay, well, I assume it must be so. It's perplexing. West Sacramento gets so much more. It seems like there should be some way to play hardball and with these districts.
West Sacramento is a very, very unique and enviable jurisdiction, going way back to the pre-Prop 13 years. So very few jurisdictions get as much as they do, but Yolo County, notoriously is relatively low in the property tax that it receives. And so then that means when it comes time to share with the cities, whether it's Davis or Woodland or any other city in the county that's annexing, there's not a lot to go around.
And then I just have two other quick, well, maybe not quick questions. But one is, you asked us to opine or, on like the open space area, and I guess I'm a little confused about that. I mean, landscape and lighting districts, CFDs, you can levy them to charge fees, so the development now pays for maintaining its open space. That just seems pretty straightforward. So I'm not sure, what the question is.
It's a consideration. Not saying this is going to be an issue or would be an issue in this area, but not all parts of Davis have additional levies for maintaining things like parks, open space, what have you. So if there's too much of a burden, that can affect the ability to have other revenue sources for things like maybe a CFD to pay for infrastructure or schools, perhaps, any host of things. So you need to be kind of mindful of the overall tax burden that projects and property owners within projects are being expected to carry there. So that would just be a contribution to that overall tax burden. Should have, perhaps some sensitivity to that on a cumulative level.
And the last question is sort of unanswerable, but I guess it goes to your absorption assumptions, and which obviously also drives the numbers, which is, what is the front page of the New York Times yesterday about how then it's Deliberation Day. Our housing prices are going to explode, the labor, the cost, the materials. The campus is going to be clobbered in terms of the cuts coming from the federal and state government. It could be a real problem, right? The prices could go up and demand could go down. What if the absorption schedule is twice as long? At this point, right, there's been no financing, nobody's borrowed to build the infrastructure, so that's good, but, to what extent, how sensitive is the analysis to a 25% increase in cost?
I think as far as an absorption period goes and what the impact of an extended absorption period would be, one of the areas where it would be most sensitive would be if you were in fact allocating all of the cost or even a portion of the cost of this additional fire station to the project. Fire stations are one of the things that we call lumpy infrastructure expenditure. So you can't just say, okay, we need 12 or 13 personnel for this station. We'll put one in year one, and then we'll add another one, and another one. You kind of need the whole complement of the staffing, and that's frankly the major component of the cost of that whenever you open that station. So if you were to open the station in year 4, but it takes you to year 15 or year 20 or year 30 to get all of the development absorbed, you are extending the period of time that you're building up that tax base to defray the cost of operating that whole fire station. So if there was some flexibility to move the fire station opening back or some way to avoid the fire station expenditure at all, as some of the speakers have suggested, then that would be really beneficial to mitigating a situation where you have a really long period for absorption. A few of the other things are kind of front-loaded, so the backbone infrastructure of phase 1, the backbone infrastructure, this is for roadways, of phase 2 plus all happens at more or less the beginning of the project. So then again, you have a smaller amount of development in place to provide that tax base to defray the cost. So that could create some issues unless there's ways to further break it down and phase it out to address that.
Okay, then Leslie, if you have any questions.
Yeah, I have a few questions. Thanks for the presentation. One question to sort of relate back to Darian's first question on the property tax allocation. Is that between the city and county, is that literally like a private negotiation, or is there any like legal parameter or how those property taxes are allocated that we go by?
It's subject to the LAFCO guidelines, Local Agency Formation Commission, which is kind of a product of state law. And just to paraphrase, it really says the city and county need to negotiate and agree on a sharing of the property taxes. And so it becomes up to the city and county to come to terms on that. And obviously the city is trying to accomplish something, and so it need to be understanding what the county's needs are and what's going to motivate them to want to come to an agreement with the city.
Thank you. And my questions are sort of to echo a lot of what we heard from public comment, because I thought a lot of them made some really good points. Has there been a fiscal analysis prepared where we don't build a fire station and instead have like costs to relocate as suggested?
No, but it would be very easy to look at the tables 1A through 1C and just remove or modify that cost line for the fire department. So if you took it out entirely, you'd have fairly significant fiscal surpluses then in most years, and certainly cumulatively. There is, I think it was maybe Matt Williams suggested, you could kind of do some sensitivity analysis and say, well, where's the point where we start to get some fiscal surpluses that are more substantial if we had only 25% of that cost, or, you know, some smaller number. So it would be pretty easy to eyeball that and figure out what those implications are.
And then, so to follow up, maybe more question for staff, like, is that model something that can be considered still by council? Like, has that already been considered, you know, like a...
I don't believe that's been considered, at least in this particular project, this development project. One of the things I would like to add though is somebody will need to pay for the construction of a fire station, even if it's moved, because the fire station needs to exist, and then also doing the relocation. So it's not literally, we can't just take an existing fire station and move it over somewhere. So we have to construct one in a new place. Now, provided we would have a building that we need to do something with, so there's either ongoing costs or, you know, demolition costs or whatever it might be, so that will have to be taken into consideration as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just wonder if you know, to the point that public commentaries made, like if it would be, like something we should really strongly consider is to weigh out the costs of doing either for the city, right?
So that could be the commission's recommendation to one, either redo analysis with another assumption, whether not to have a fire station at all, or a fire station that is, you know, construct new one and relocate, as was suggested. So that could be a recommendation that comes from this commission to go to council and the planning commission.
Okay, and then circling back to, I think, one of your first slides on the capital infrastructure costs that are not considered in the analysis. I'm not super familiar with how it works. So how, if those are going to be funded like a separate one-time cost, like what are the expectations that the city can have in responsibility for funding those costs?
Are you referring to the infrastructure cost? So I'm going to guess that the city would like for the developer to build the infrastructure. Usually, it depends, either developer does it or CFDs formed infrastructure, like a bonded CFD, and then the developer is reimbursed, but the community that's being built then pays over, let's say, 30 years or so for that infrastructure that was built. We have a few CFD districts currently that pay for infrastructure. One of the most recent ones is the Cannery development. And so it was a 30-year bond that was issued for the amount of the developer had to put in. So it's being paid through, you know, a 30-year period.
That's fine. Thank you.
Steve, do you have any questions?
I've got a few. One of the things we were asked to write our input on was the assumptions. And I looked at them, and frankly, they look pretty vanilla. I don't have a significant comment one way or another. But what would be helpful is to understand which assumptions drive the model. Which ones, where's the sensitivity?
I think I mentioned the property valuation assumptions is one that drives a fair number of the revenue items in the model. So I would say that's an important one. Not to belabor the fire station, but the cost of the fire station, how that cost is allocated, to me is one of the single biggest considerations. That's why we have these three different alternatives that we presented so that people can kind of see what the implications are about different ways of looking at that. I would say the other assumptions are probably not super, individually, there aren't any that really stand out to me. But an important one, broadly speaking, is the 75% service cost variability assumption. That would change a lot, for example, if we assumed that costs were 100% variable. I want to clarify, though, on that point that Again, because we're looking at case study approaches for some of these services, we are not assuming across the board 75% service cost variabilities. For the fire station, for the park maintenance, for the road maintenance, these are all pretty major expenditure items. There's no 75% factor in there. They're 100% cost allocated for those ones. So I would say those ones, property taxes, service cost variability, the house or the property valuations, and primarily the housing, because that's the major component of the development, would be some of the major kind of move the needle type of assumptions in the model.
Is the 75% unique to Davis, or is that because you'd hope with that much growth, more of your cost structure would be fixed. And
yeah, no, I wouldn't say it's unique to Davis. I have seen those numbers be as low as 50% in some cases, or in some cases to say they're 100% fixed when a city says, we don't think we're going to expand this particular service. So, an example of that would be they say, well, city manager's office, we're not going to get a second city manager if we double in size, so forth. So there are some services where there might be a rationale for it to be less than that, but 75%, I would say, is within the range that I see.
again, I would argue that it's a fine assumption. Operationally, we ought to challenge that though, because we're never going to get out of our budget stretched if all we do is have the same cost structure as we grow. We can't grow out of it. We talked a little bit, there were some questions about the capital infrastructure not being in this. We sort of waved it away. It's the developer will take care of it. But there is ongoing capital needs. The roads get accelerated out. There's more traffic over the roads in the town outside the development. And then there's utilities, because those are not real variable. They're very lumpy as we have to add capacity. And has that analysis been done, sort of with, at least at a high level, to say sort of where are we going to need to get capital to support the growth of more water, more sewer, more stormwater?
So again, just like the roads infrastructure, wastewater, water, storm drainage, when it's originally put in at the very beginning, the expectation is the developer will be building that infrastructure and then giving it to the city to maintain. Because those are utility funds, they will be calculated in your rates when they make the assumptions and do the studies for the fee study, at the 5-year fee studies as you have. And so the capital is going to be then built in. If any new needs to happen, it will be built in. So additional units will be paying for their share, but they also will be built in into the future rates.
I guess, okay. The other, particularly, again, this is revolves around a capital issue, whether it's the developer or whether it's the city, is delays. These projects never happen on time. Things that are designed to go in a certain order come out of phase, and that always puts strain. Is it common to sort of have scenarios that say, reasonable worst case, how could this look? Because of just changes in the timing assumptions. And again, I don't mean the big 15-year, 7-year, but I mean timing like, the road went in and then we had to wait half a year before we did the next thing or whatever.
Probably more commonly, we would do some kind of sensitivity analysis where we've got the base model set up right now. And if there was a desire to say, well, what happens if the fire station goes in earlier? Or what happens if we move some of that development more into phases 2, 3, and 4 as far as the year schedule goes? So we can test that out to see how things change if we start moving things around. But we don't normally create a scenario up front that says, here's a worst case scenario or a best case scenario. We try to represent the project as best we can, as we understand it, and make our educated guesses. But then, if there is some critical factor, then we can do some sensitivity.
Yeah, it's more about the thought process of saying what can go wrong and how would we deal with it, or how would it affect us, than sort of coming up with another number. I just think, we got a happy path here, nothing ever goes on the happy path. How unhappy could we be? And what could we do to mitigate that?
Yeah, I think some sensitivity analysis potentially could help to answer those kind of questions.
Final question is, and I think it's come through a couple of our questions, is I heard the suggestion that break even is pretty good. Yeah, because it's a residential project and no qualms there. I wonder if we should be thinking beyond that. Whether it's specifically this project, we don't get too many opportunities to bring in 1,500 homes, or whatever it is. And so we should be thinking about ways to create a project or a set of projects that help relieve us of some of our fiscal strain. If this is just a break even, we haven't accomplished anything. We've done a big development. Socially, we've accomplished some things. But financially, we're leaving the city in the same place. And I wonder if we're undershooting in that regard. And I don't know if there's an answer. I don't know if that was a question.
I will leave that to others, I guess, to answer. We're trying to analyze this particular project and give a decent portrayal of what its fiscal impacts would be. This is the project that's been proposed here.
Thank you.
I'll pass it to David.
Thank you for your presentation. I have some questions here. Got several questions already about the fire station, so I'd like to get some clarity, see if I have this right. There's been no decision yet about the fire station. It's a possibility for this project. There's a lot of other issues outside of dealing with the fiscal issue with the project, response time, which state, is that correct? Right.
So that's correct. So as Matt presented earlier, we currently have certain areas that are outside of the 5-minute response time. So with that, in talking with the fire department, what they are looking at, if we're building 1,800 homes, we cannot manage, doing it without a fire station. Now, whether there is an alternative way to do it, that's again one of the options that could be discussed. As of right now, the proposal, the fiscal analysis that's been done now, we're looking at having a 4th fire station and how do we spread the costs of that fire station or the operations of the fire station. And so that's why I was saying that earlier. This could be one of the recommendations that the commission makes as to maybe looking into no fire station or relocation of a fire station. So those are potential options.
Yeah, so I guess we can debate at the end. It seems like it's beyond just us, and obviously it is, I think, with all these other factors. Do you know the process? Do you have an idea now? What will be the process to determine whether or not a fire station should be proposed as part of this project? Will there be a separate city council agenda item that just focuses on the fire station? How do you see this moving forward?
I believe the proposal right now for the fiscal commission to look at the current fiscal analysis that proposed, make recommendations to either say, yes, we agree with the assumptions, or we would like to look at the assumptions either changed or rerun the fiscal analysis with some other version of the assumptions. My understanding is that then is being presented or will be presented to the planning commission and the city council. They will take recommendations of various commissions in various areas, obviously, into consideration to determine if they want to proceed with the project.
Okay, thank you. So let me ask another question that I heard in public comment, dealing with this issue. What happens after decades of the project and some lump sum liabilities at the end potentially that you have this project that's been built and then 20 years from now you need to do replacement costs for stuff. What's your response to that? Is that a legitimate concern?
It's a legitimate concern. One of the big things will be the roadway infrastructure, because that's, again, it's one of these public infrastructure pieces where you don't have a user base that's going to pay fees to use it in theory. So the monies have to come from somewhere. We do have programmed into the fiscal model the average annual expenditure per roadway lane mile within the city for maintenance of roads. And my understanding is that that does include things like periodic, overlays, redoing the pavement, and so forth. Understand that we're projecting costs out from the year one for incurring these kind of roadway maintenance costs. The typical pattern is you go some number of years without having to make major improvements, and then towards the end of life, that's when you're starting to spend more to do these more major things that have to be done on a periodic, cyclical basis. So this flow of revenue that we're sort of identifying as being needed to cover those costs could actually be utilized elsewhere in the city until the project's roadway gets to that point in its life cycle where it needs the investment. So there is some cycling of this, and it's not to say that there's not going to be any provision for maintenance of these roadways within the project. The other infrastructure, as Elena mentioned, would, for say, sewer systems, water systems, that's going to be covered by the ratepayers on a monthly basis with their bills. Park maintenance, again, we have some maintenance costs there. It's going to primarily be for mowing the lawns and taking care of the landscape and those kind of things. But I think there's some smaller, minor repair and replacement type things within that budget. That per acre cost per year may not be capturing very large capital replacement things. You had a swimming pool and you needed to completely rebuild the whole swimming pool, that probably wouldn't be captured in that.
Well, that's really helpful. Do I have this right? Then probably the biggest risk in terms of these future infrastructure costs is the roads, the water, sewer, et cetera. That probably has a funding base of more likely to be able to accommodate that. Mm-hmm. Okay. So there is some risk, and hard though to quantify that risk. That's what I'm hearing too, depending on how that money is ultimately spent for maintenance and
what the needs are.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. I need just a few more minutes. Could you look at your report, Mr. Code, on page 4? Because you specifically asked for some input on some of the assumptions. So I'm not an expert on the assumptions, but I do have some questions, just general questions for you. I think I've heard you before, so I know you're going to be helpful for these. So you're making these assumptions, I believe, do I have these right? These are conservative assumptions that generally have industry acceptance?
Yes, I wouldn't say they're overly conservative, they're reasonable. That's what we're trying to strike that balance. We don't want to portray things in an excessively positive light, but we also don't want to portray things excessively negative.
Fair enough. So, and I did the same thing with the DISC project. So there's pushback on this. There was talk at the time, well, why don't we have a range of assumptions? We could have the rosy scenario and then the pessimistic scenario. That's something you could do if you were asked to.
Absolutely. In fact, this key assumption sheet, it's linked to the model. So if you were to say, what if we had X% inflation instead of 2.5%, we could put that number in and it would run through the model and we'd see the results pretty easily. absolutely.
And I'm not advocating for that, I just wanted clarity so that my colleagues could hear it. And then I think you stated that on the revenue side, the assumptions relating to property values, that's a key component. And on the cost side, do I have this wrong? Maybe one of the key assumptions is dealing with this variable cost. You have a 75% variable cost. Is that correct? Yes. Yeah. And if the assumption was 100% variable, that would then make the project not pencil out as well because we're spending more, we're assuming more city staff, right?
Correct.
And I know in the past there's been conversation about whether that is the right number, 75 or 100. I know for DISC it got debated, landed at 75. What's the thinking today? Is that still where you would land as your professional opinion? I know it's not precise science, but is that?
Yes, that seems like a reasonable place to land, and again, recognizing that we're not talking about 75% for all the services, just the ones that are calculated on an average cost basis.
Okay, well I thought that's what you said, but I wanted to ask you so everybody could hear it. And then the other question that has arisen in the past is there a way to break these out by department or function? I'm focusing on the fire department because that's the one that's probably most at issue. Police come in second, public works third, in my opinion. So is that a possibility to have? Would that further the analysis to try to break it out by the department, or is that just too much detail?
I'm not quite sure what you're thinking of, different from what we have,
Yeah.
because we do summarize the costs of each department separately.
So for the fire department, for instance, maybe that's 100%. Yeah.
We could change,
Yeah.
well, it is 100% because that's in a case study projection mode. So we're looking at allocating 100% of the cost of either the additional station alone or for the additional station plus the existing services spread across the entire city. So that, but for example, if you said, how about for public works, engineering and transportation department, can you have a different assumption for that one? Yes, we could.
You could. In your opinion, though, I believe that's probably a lot of detail, that some value, but
Yeah, that one's probably not likely to move the needle a whole lot because of just the size of the cost that we're projecting versus police and fire, which are really two major ones. I think also the park maintenance.
okay, then I just have a couple more questions. Could you look at table 19C, that's the fire department expenditure? That's the low cost, or maybe we should go to 19B, the mid cost, because I think that was the one that you highlighted. I'm skipping over 19A, the high cost. And I want to make sure I hear your understanding of this analysis. And if you look at that table at the bottom, I think you get a summary of the cost allocation to the project. And in year one, it's 33,000, and my printer fails about year 10, but it was about 1,889,000. Tell me what's going on in year 10 with that 1 million.
So by year 10, you have the project probably about a little more than halfway built out. So it's getting about half of its total ultimate allocation of cost for that new fire station. And again, it's combining the existing fire department costs with the cost for the new station. So you have this expanded fire department, and then it's dividing that cost across all of the development existing within the city now, plus the development absorbed to that point in time within Village Farms. So at that point in time, that's its share of the citywide fire department system, including a fourth fire station.
So is this right? It's costing the city at that point $1 million?
Well, the station's costing the city whatever, 3 point something or more because it's inflated, right? So it's an inflated 3.4 million. It's costing the city that much in that year. And then the share of that cost that's getting allocated to Village Farms is that lower number, which is not necessarily strictly funding the Village Farm fire station, but it's funding the Village Farms share of the entire system, including the new fire station, and it just happens to work out that.
Okay. So, I mean, that's at a really, I think, important level of complexity. I don't know how you could express that in a report, but I think just reading that number, it's hard to glean that from that in the future, so that'll be one of my suggestions at the end. And is it possible to translate that million a year 10 into any kind of personnel costs, expected personnel costs at that point? Or is that just combined with the...
It could be related back to the cost of the personnel staffing that fourth station. Again, by build out, the number that I looked at was how much of the cost is being covered by Village Farms, and it's about a third of the cost of the new fire station. So it means that Village Farms is creating the tax base that helps to pay for about a third of that station.
Okay, one last chart and I'm done. I mean, we could go longer if we had more time, but I'm not going to. Look at table, if you would, of your report, the table 1B. And you've got, again, the mid-cost allocation for the fire department. And do I have this right? This is the bottom line part of your analysis. This addresses the question whether or not this project is a net neutral in terms of impacts to the city. And I would look at the bottom net general fund balance at the bottom. Again, we have the cumulative totals. Do I have that right? That's if somebody, because this is what comes out of this. What is the impact of this project on city finances, and is it neutral or not? And my answer would be, well, I would look to this chart to try to give you the best estimate based on the model and assuming all the different risks that you have with the variables and so forth. Do I have that right? That's
correct.
That's the line.
Yeah.
So if you were just looking at it today with what the analysis is, and I'm going to have some comments about where we're looking at it today, that it looks like a net neutral, right?
More or less.
Yeah, okay. Okay, that's what I have. Thank you for being patient with me.
Matt, do you have any questions?
Just I'll take thanks for all your stuff. Can just be crystal clear, so the upfront capital costs are not in here. And
Right.
then within the expenditures, I was clear if that was just pure cash, or if that's like OpEx excluding CapEx for replacement costs, is that correct?
Yeah, these are all figures that would be derived from the operating budget. So to the extent that you have some kind of major capital expenditure that's handled through the CIP part of the budget as opposed to the general fund, that wouldn't be incorporated here.
This might be a dumb question in municipal context, but like why would we include on that in the analysis? Is because those are just separate tracks legally. And okay, so
Well,
are those
let
going
me-
to be evaluated in like holistically?
The way it generally works is that.
Could you hear all that, Don?
I could, but you're not really speaking into your mic,
Oh,
so
okay.
you're not.
Sorry.
Sorry, okay, so a question was, is it typical to consider the one-time capital costs as separate from the operating budget? And I'd say the answer generally is yes, that is typical. But there's also typically monies going out of the general fund on an annual basis that are being allocated for capital expenditures. And that's reflected in our transfers out table and the line within these summaries where, as available, the city finance director will correct me if I'm wrong, but as available, the city allocates additional available general fund monies to do capital projects. And so to the extent there's fiscal surplus and there's reserves have been taken care of and all that, the city council might say, okay, we're going to allocate $2 million to some capital project. We have a line in here for capital expenditure or the transfers out where that occurs, but we've assumed that it essentially remains at its current level, which is a kind of a minimum maintenance of effort level for roadway maintenance. So to the extent that the fiscal analysis identifies any surpluses, then it could be understood that it would be within the city council's purview to say some of that surplus in some year could be allocated to capital projects amongst other priorities that the council identifies. But it's more on an as available basis as opposed to, you know, we're guaranteeing this much is going to be spent on these things.
And, you know, there's been some discussion around running different sensitivities for, you know, home price appreciation and, you know, the fixed cost ratio. Like, are we talking about those in like a theoretical sense? Yeah, those could be done, or will they be done? I mean, maybe that's more a question for Lynn and Don, but because I don't know how you do this analysis, like in a decision, not directly you specifically, but I don't know how you like look at this in a decision-usual way without, you know, you got 3 cases, but then you.
Yeah, I think if this commission were to feel very strongly that some scenarios should be analyzed or some assumptions should be tested for sensitivity or something like that, then that could be considered, and I'm not sure if we would need to look to the council to give direction as to exactly what we do, what that process would be.
I mean, I would say I would sure hope that would be done, because it's, you know, it's not like a preordained right that, you know, home prices are going to go up in value. Again, that's not directly to you personally, it's just, you know, without that type of sensitivity, I mean, we just don't have a real handle on sort of what the downside is. I guess I just had one other one and then a comment to wrap up. Like, why recommend maybe this one for the city, but why recommend the middle case? Why not recommend the most favorable case to the city, given that it's just a few $100,000 difference on an NPV basis?
I think it's a fairly large dollar amount. So what we were looking at literally is sensitivity and to present a comparison. What is the worst case scenario? What is potentially the best case scenario? And where do, yes, and where could we land somewhere in the middle? So is it likely it's going to be the worst? Maybe not, but at least you have that, I think as Matt said, some bookends to see like, okay, here's the worst, here's the best. We're going to be somewhere in the middle. We don't know exactly where, but these are the assumptions we used for the fiscal analysis, and one of the larger ones, based on the dollars, obviously, is the fire station cost, the operation of the fire station cost. So we were trying to get it, you know, put it in perspective to say, as you all looking at, okay, well, can we do sensitivity? So we wanted to put in some sensitivity to the analysis because this is a large cost. One of those probably that we're looking for you to review and say, okay, is it reasonable to use in the assumption? Or do you have any other version of it? And as we've heard from the public commentaries that there's a possibility of a different assumption, at least 2, I think what I've heard, is no fire station at all. And the second one was, okay, well, instead of building a new one, you relocate fire stations, 1 or 2, depending on, you know, how it was presented. So it's potential for another, obviously, assumption, and that could be a recommendation from the commission. But what we were looking for is, okay, where can we land reasonably in terms of looking at the cost and what it will do from the fiscal analysis standpoint for this particular project, which is kind of difficult to analyze without comparing it to something, and sometimes it's difficult to compare different projects. They're all different, right? So we were looking to see, okay, well, are the assumptions, can you review the assumptions of this fiscal analysis? Tell us if you think these are reasonable assumptions to use. And then, you know, because yes, we changed the assumptions of some of them you believe are not appropriate, then, or unreasonable, and you think something else is better, then that would be a recommendation from the commission to say, okay, well, we think these assumptions need to be adjusted. Let's see what the analysis would be under a different assumption method. So for a way to figure out fire station specifically, we were looking at a variety of assumptions. What is, I guess from our perspective, what seems to be the most reasonable way to allocate the cost of operating a fire station? So one was 100% burden on village farms. What would it look like? Seems, in some cases, I would say maybe not exactly reasonable, just because we currently have a need for a fire station because of the response time. The other version was, okay, well, what other ways to allocate? So then that's why Matt used just the city with the village farm. And then the third one was, okay, we're going to allocate it across the entire city with any other future developments that may occur. Now, you have to remember, this is City of Davis. Development is not as easy, so making too generous assumptions would be difficult, which is why assumption 3 and 2 are so close, because historically, there hasn't been that much of development going on, so there are certain things that we have to assume as part of general plan, part of housing element, so certain things are part of it, so we made assumptions, and that was the assumption number 3, which to expend it even more. So we've settled on a middle ground to say, okay, well, we think this is reasonable. If you believe it should be assumption number 3, okay. But 2 and 3 seem to be very close in terms
Yeah,
of.
that's what I'm asking, because number 2 is not the middle. It's like number 1's over here, number 3's over here, and then number 2 is.
Correct.
Right. So like, why not, if we're already at number 2, why not just?
Well, if you choose the third assumption is the most reasonable to use, then, you know, you can recommend that that assumption would be it.
Could I just ask one clarifying question? Are we talking about an allocation difference, or are we talking about a real cost difference here, what the city pays?
It's an allocation difference.
So I mean, it's just like a game. It's not, you know, this isn't real money. The real money is how much the infrastructure for fire is in Davis, right? It's not how we allocate to, that's interesting, but it's not how we should make an economic decision.
But also, I just started to fill in with, how does it even work legally? I understand that future development could be told you have to sign a development agreement or a CFD that adds some pro rata cost for this fire station, which will be, because the existing developments, they're done, they've signed their agreements. Are we gonna go back to them? I don't think we can. So we're just going back to Steve's point, we're just saying they're gonna get some share of the property tax, general property tax voters, which is fine, except that we get this anemic share of property tax, so it's just a zero-sum game.
Just one thing to Commissioner Garrettson's question. I think you were asking, why would you look at that middle scenario that's slightly less favorable in terms of the outcome of the project instead of the third scenario, which is a little better? And I think the answer there is that, you know, we can say we're doing this analysis, we're assuming that Village Farms gets built, but we can't necessarily assume that any other development gets built alongside Village Farms. So it's just a little bit more conservative to stick to, okay, what does it look like if it's just Village Farms?
Oh, I see.
And we acknowledge that it actually doesn't move the needle a whole lot if we looked at this other increment of growth in addition to Village Farms. They're essentially giving us the same result.
Maybe just a comment to wrap up. I guess I admit I'm sort of like parachuting in here tonight from my day job. But
Thank you.
I don't understand why there would be a bias towards adding a 4th fire station without first considering, do we really need it? Or could there be this alternative of just relocating one and incurring a one-off expenditure, because what we're talking about here is taking on something much bigger, longer tail, with a much wider range of outcomes, and uncertainty. Some might be favorable to the city, but some of them might be not, and some of them could be disastrous, in theory. Like why? It's a little harder for me to understand why we jump past, the first two. So I just hope the council would take the first two seriously, either not building or just relocating one in order to sort of smooth out the 5-minute response time across the city. Because really with this, is this thing gonna get built without village farms? This just seems like a stretch from where I sit. That's all.
Does anyone have any other clarifying questions? I mean, otherwise I can go with some of my questions. Do you have a comment?
No, I just wanted to add one more thing. We talked about the fire station. One of the other assumptions is, and I just want to make sure it's out there, is related to the funding mechanisms of the open space and the natural spaces. So city's goal, obviously, we do not necessarily want the general fund to carry the burden of maintaining those spaces. They are fairly large if you look in acreage. And so in some cases may double what we currently have to maintain. So one of the things we're looking at is what are the possible other funding mechanisms that are out there. So I'm just adding to that because we've discussed all the other items, but we didn't really touch on this particular one. And I just want to make sure that it's out there that the city's, or at least the management's goal is not necessarily to have that burden. But we wanted to hear from a commission, perhaps you feel otherwise, or have suggestions.
I think that was going to be my first question. After looking at the packet, I did see that we have potential funding mechanisms for the open natural spaces. And I guess my question is that there's mention of LLMDs, CFDs, or trust here as different options for financing that. For paying for habitat green belts, and I'm less familiar with this, but these are some, for the LLMDs and the CFDs, they have to be voted on by, or no? Okay.
So with LLMDs, yes, it's an assessment, and in this particular case, I believe we described it a little bit in the staff report. An engineer's report is usually created into determining what is the cost to maintain that particular district. So that's the green spaces between the homes, landscaping, that type of stuff. And then engineer's report also figures out for each property what is the benefit, and respective allocable amount is then added to property tax dollars for LLMD. So, and it has to be beneficial to that particular property owner. One of the things with LLMDs is that if you need to have an increase in cost, it has to go through Proposition 218 vote, which means the property voters actually have to vote for an increase. So let's say, as an example, our costs grow and the property voters decline it. So we may not be able to perhaps maintain it to the standard that property owners might want, because it only covers a partial amount of costs. So that's kind of LLMD and kind of some of the limitations there potentially. With a community facilities district, usually set up at the time when the developer owns the property. That's when the district is set up, and as it being subdivided, it's then already voted in. And the property owners, when they buy the home, they share the burden of that particular allocation, which is determined based on rate and method of apportionment, which is usually done with the consultant's assistance, and again, depending on the benefit to that particular property, and the rate is set for that property. So there's a few things that internally we have to figure out what is the best funding source, and it really will depend on the needs of that particular development, what's the most beneficial. It might be more than one potentially, right, if need be. And then the third option as discussed here was, do we find a third party that might want to take maintenance of those particular facilities, or set up a trust, maybe in some way to fund the maintenance of those spaces. So that's just kind of as a possibilities that are there. I mean, I guess technically the possibility could be, you know, the general fund, which we're hoping it's not. It's a large space, and we would not to have, I would not want to have that burden on the general fund personally, as a finance director. So, but those are the options that we currently have, that presented to you for a consideration.
Is an HOA a possibility? Homeowners association?
So I believe those will be done once the development is built, and then it could be determined that HOA would be set up. That would not be something the city would normally control. But we have, I think, prior developments where we've had HOAs that have eventually dissolved and decided not to do the work. But since that's something that is potentially city responsibility, if it's our land, we may still have to take care of certain things. Did you have?
Yeah, so I will just add a little bit to that. So we don't yet know if the state and federal regulatory agencies are going to require that 47.1 acres be in city control. It may very well be that neither the applicant nor the city has any say in that. So it could very well be the city's responsibility in perpetuity to maintain it. Those state and federal regulatory agencies would also prescribe what maintenance looks like and what level of maintenance looks like. So we don't yet know what those ongoing operating costs could be. I will say that the applicant has indicated that they are not planning to create a homeowners association. So we would be looking at more public funding mechanisms such as a CFD or a LLMD or private nonprofit trust, conservatorship, those kinds of things for the 47.1 acres.
So common space within the development, how is that paid for?
That would also be looking to be dedicated to the city, like right-of-way landscaping, streets, all of that would be public.
So just reading here, I think I thought to create such a district, the property owners must vote to approve the tax. I guess that's what my question was really, is that that's before things are, like, is there a possibility that that approval wouldn't go through?
Generally, if it's between the city and a developer, hopefully it will. I would assume it will.
Okay,
It would be certainly perhaps more difficult if you have multiple property owners that may need to have a requirement for all of them to vote in. So usually when the CFD is created, it generally happens at the time when the developer still owns the land.
that makes sense. Thank you. I guess with that, then, my other question was just related to some of these assumptions around labor cost increases, like cost increases, material cost increases. I think we hear a lot about things like tariffs, or even just in the state legislature, I think there's a bill related to prevailing wage on projects and things like that. And so I just think that over the span of 15 years, that costs can change. Would the city, and so if things were to increase, as the city, if the timeline were to increase, would the city still have to cover kind of services without like matching revenue? And would that be a challenge? Or is that an assumption that is built in here?
We touched on this a little bit earlier, and the answer was we've got a set of assumptions built in about how the various service responsibilities phase in, and then also about how the various development components phase in. So if something happens, project is approved, and something happens in the future where the phasing of the infrastructure, for example, is fixed, but then the time period for absorption of the other revenue-generating development gets extended, then that could have some impacts on this. It's not necessarily the case that the phasing of the infrastructure would be fixed. There could be some flexibility in how that's phased in, a little bit slower if the development's going slower. Certainly, I don't think they would jump towards putting in infrastructure, say for phase 3, if they were still working on getting phase 1 built out. I think they would, it's to their interest, to the city's interest, to time that so that it's not done earlier than necessary. But again, with something major like the fire station, if it were to be built and staffed within the project, then the timing of that would be pretty important relative to when the development occurs. So if it's being committed to early on in the process and the development takes longer to build out, that just means that it takes longer to build up that tax base to help defray that cost, however it's allocated.
And then just clarifying, that 50-50 city-county split, that's something that is like a reasonable assumption, very common, or have there been cases where it's maybe been 25-75 or a different percentage?
At least for the residential projects, my understanding is that that 50-50 roughly has been pretty typical for the county to agree to. For a different project that had a much different service or revenue profile, maybe they would want to look at it a little bit differently. But for primarily residential projects, that's what has typically been the split.
And then I think a commenter mentioned soil toxins or that sort of thing. Is the city responsible for things like dealing with that? Like, would that increase a cost to the city potentially for maintenance or anything like that?
The burden of any cleanup or mitigation for any sort of toxins is borne by the developer. And that's subject to state and federal regulations as well.
And then I think just my final question was around the fire truck response time. I know right now the hope is to have it in 5 minutes, and so is this something that the fire department thinks is like, we need like half a fire station, or I mean, obviously this would be a full fire station, but like, what is the need? Is the need like a quarter of a fire station, a half a fire station, maybe a fire station could be moved? Like, how much extra service or support is needed?
I don't have the numbers for how many households are not currently within the 5-minute response time, but the 5-minute response time is a general plan policy goal. It also is consistent with current fire standards. So it's possible, I'm not a fire expert, but it is possible that we get enough rooftops that do not have adequate fire response time. There could be repercussions, perhaps from homeowners insurance, and those kinds of ramifications. So that it is something that we need to look at. The metric is response time, the 5-minute response time. The metric is not how many fires we have or necessarily how many houses are outside of the response time, but we do need to be cognizant that we already have a significant number of homes that are not within the city's goal response time.
Thank you. I just wanted to see if anyone else had any comments that, based on some of the things that were said.
I have a clarifying question on the hazardous waste. So you were saying that it's borne by the developer, and I understand like the hazardous waste fees that are generated at the time of development, that makes sense that that's borne by the developer. But the longer term ones, like monitoring soil toxicity or any liability that comes from in the longer term, that's borne by the city, isn't it?
Well, it depends on what we're talking about, like specifically, but there are monitoring wells out there now, and those will remain pursuant to state regulations. So what is happening now will continue to happen as long as those other regulating agencies, whether it's state or federal, dictate to the city what the requirements are.
Just a few quick things. First is we desperately need more housing. So to the extent that like at least from my perspective, any of the comments I've made suggest that this project should be slowed down in any way. I disavow them. They are. This project should be done yesterday. Then I guess I'd also say back to the 80% thing, or the county getting 20% and some other entities getting, I would go back to the school district. The superintendent was just here saying we need more students, and the way school finance works in California, they're going to get the same amount per student anyway from the state's general fund. So giving a little more to the city so it will approve this project so they can get more students to get more per student funding is actually a win-win for everyone. So I'm not sure what the big holdup is. And then coming back to the absorption issue, I mean, the real danger from my mind seems, build a fire station, don't build a fire station. Use a CFD, impose it on the community, on the district, have them pay for their landscaping. And the question is just, will it pencil out? Will people still pay a CFD tax that high? I don't know the answer to it, but I assume it's quite possible. But my big concern is that there's a big CFD, we build a fire station, we build the backbone infrastructure, and then the housing doesn't get built because of the tariffs. And those, in the handful of CFD defaults, that's the scenario, right? The developer runs out of money, or it doesn't make sense for the developer, it just walks away. And so I would just advise the council to only approve the final step of actually bonding against this development when you're really sure it's going to work out, when these assumptions have been not just stress tested theoretically, but stress tested against reality in terms of the actual expenses.
I just want to comment in my prior kind of seeing CFD experience and issuances. Usually if the property is not developed, so you tax to a maximum tax rate the developed properties.
Right.
But if it's not sufficient, the developer usually contributes for the undeveloped property component to make up the difference to pay the debt.
That's right. And then if they can't, because it's not worth it to them, they walk away and the CFD defaults. And so there's a list on this California Debt Advisory website on CFDs that have gone south. Not that often, but when they do, that's the story. It's not worth it for the developer to pay that anymore if they can't develop the property. And usually there's a separate LLC, and so it's their bankruptcy remote. All these things.
So I think we can probably start discussing some recommendations. And I know that one of the first ones I heard was related to looking at the option of relocating a fire station or adding different, doing an analysis on different options, such as relocating a fire station, multiple fire stations, I'm not sure, but another option like that, like not building a fire station, and what that could look like. So just for clarification in terms of process here, I obviously want to get feedback from everyone here, but would we need to move for that particular recommendation to be included, or could we kind of do it all at once?
So there's a couple different ways you can approach this. Basically, your agenda item is sort of structured for you, first asking you to look at whether you think the various assumptions were reasonable, and then also to ask you to look at what funding mechanisms you think might be appropriate for that open space habitat area. You may decide you want to group your recommendations that way. I think what I would just suggest, having just watched a number of commissions go through this process, you as chair may want to try to see if you can list out what you've heard so far as the concerns that seem to move toward a motion. And then for each one of those, you probably want to really discuss it and refine the motion. I'm just throwing this out there, it's your prerogative, but the sense you get is that there's quite a bit of agreement in the room on a whole group of suggestions, you might present that as a single motion. But if you're sensing there's some disagreement or further discussion, you may want to break things apart more. I'm happy to offer other thoughts as you go.
No, that's helpful. And I think that what I've been hearing so far is that there is some interest in having a little bit more sensitivity now presented to City Council for their own evaluation, and maybe some some additional analysis for other options related to things like fire stations. And so I can list out what I've heard so far, and if anybody has any additional items, we can maybe discuss those, but I think the first would be an analysis of the option to relocate fire stations or not build a fire station, that sort of thing. Maybe looking more at that assumption more closely. I think another one was adding, maybe looking at assumptions related to construction delays, or even just like cost increases that might contribute to construction delays. Which could include even just construction delays on the part of the developer for the development, but also maybe for the fire station. And then the other piece would be doing, I think I heard like Steve and Niall talking a little bit about additional sensitivity analysis around like home prices and all sorts of and a few other things. Suggestion from David for just some greater clarity around some numbers. And potentially the city council to consider having a conversation with the school districts to see if there's some sort of negotiation there. And what else do I have here? My handwriting is not very good. So I think just a recommendation to city council to really think about only approving bonding when there's some assurance that, you know, this development would be developed to its fullest extent. And maybe that involves some sort of some understanding of what financing, like what the stability of the financing is for the developer. I'm not sure, but yeah, so those are some of the potential recommendations. I don't know if anyone has any others to add.
I won't be contrarian, but on the fire station, I think it's a bit of a red herring. We spent more time talking about the fire station than any other aspect of this project. And to me, I understand why, but if it's an allocation issue, not a real cost issue, we've got to be looking at the fire response for Davis and to have a plan. And this project may facilitate that plan or may not, but to make this project dependent on a fire station, I'm not sure I get that.
I think it's, well, my understanding is just that that is like a significant upfront capital, or like a capital cost, and so to just sort of break it out that way.
Yeah, but I'm not sure, I agree with that, but I'm not sure it has anything to do with this project, though. We either need incremental fires response or not. And clearly this project will create more demand. But how that's a plan we got to build around fire response, not around, I think. Again, I understand it's an important issue. I just don't think it should dominate the conversation.
That's fair. And there was one that I wanted to propose as well in terms of with the LLMD or the CFD or potentially a trust, maybe a recommendation to city council that they, I don't know about require, but like have some assurance that the funding mechanisms there will just be more fully structured before moving forward, just so that there's a little more certainty and clarity around that, because otherwise the city would, to Elena's point, really have to take on some costs into the general fund.
I think one of the things that came up with a number of us was the capital costs not being reflected in the model. And so getting some information around, not even cost, but how this might affect utilities. I understand there's hookup charges, and I understand that they'll pay for, this community will pay for incremental, but the ongoing cost of supporting that, the lumpiness of it is real. What happens 15 years from now when this capital expenditure has to be renewed? You know, and again, we got captured a little bit on the roads, but we don't have it captured necessarily for wastewater treatment and whatnot. And I don't know what the specific issues are and the specific how this influences the utilities, but I think understanding that is an important aspect of this.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then I think Leslie also just an understanding of the potential costs related to like any sort of hazardous waste cleanup or anything that might end up with the city, like further down the line. I think those were all of them. I kind of lost track of where I was. But David, did you have any others that you wanted to add?
I will, but I'm gonna let yours go first, and then I'll see how it lands. But yeah, I do have some suggestions.
Okay, well, I think these are the ones that I sort of heard from everyone here. Did you have another that?
Yeah, can I add that I think the city council should consider whether these projects, I mean, we're hearing that they are by nature break even, that's the routine way that they go. Whether that's a sound like financial plan, we're incurring more liability for the prospect of breaking even. And so is that a good plan, or should we be changing our development projects so that they're revenue positive, so that we have potential for cushion in case the break-even plan we're not breaking even and now we're net negative, and then we don't have to consider additional taxes, or these could potentially pay for themselves if the models that we anticipated didn't go at the best case scenario of net break-even. Something like higher density or mixed use, those kinds of development projects should be considered.
And then, David, were there any others that you mentioned that I missed?
I have ideas, but I just would rather us focus on some of these things before, because mine are more general. So I want to see how this lands, and maybe I just shut up once we see what gets discussed.
Well, maybe, so the ones that I mentioned thus far, is everyone here in agreement with those being recommendations to city council, and then we can add on as well? I just feel like I've made the list very long.
Could you specify then exactly what the recommendation is? Start with the fire station, and then we could track that. If you want to make a motion, we could vote on it or get a second. That'd be my suggestion.
Okay, that makes sense. Maybe I would just go down the list and then try to get a motion for each one. Maybe that would be the simplest way to do this one. But so one, taking your comments into account, but so an analysis of the of relocating or a different option around the fire station, and just doing an additional analysis there. Can I get a motion to add that in as a recommendation?
So you need a second. I'll second to get a conversation going on it. So I'll second that.
Okay, so.
If I understood your motion, you want to raise to the council to consider alternatives relating to the fire station because of fiscal issues. Is that?
Yeah, that's right. So I just want to see an additional analysis of other options, such as removing a fire station or moving a fire station from the plan, and then I remove that. Would you second?
I second it for the purposes of discussion.
Would anyone be opposed to making that recommendation?
Well, we're going to open it up for discussion. So I want then maybe we can vote. I want to share what I believe on this, so you can process it. So my first thought is this is not the right commission. This is not obviously the full story. Something like dealing with a fire station, that'll be a negotiation with the developer and the city, land dedication, all these other factors, and then if it's not part of the land dedication by the developer, that opens up something else for the city to negotiate with the developer. So it's really premature to me to try to even figure out as to this, but my thought is that the city in the past has evaluated, I just dug up some of the reports, has evaluated the merits of having another fire station and response time, liability costs, etc. So that data is already out there. It's not before this commission, but that information is out there, and that would be part of, I think, the review, whether it's a staff review or this commission again with someone else. That could be done with more information, so we can make a more informed decision, I believe. And then, but to the extent there's a desire to have another fire station at this development, which is a big assumption. I'm not weighing in on that at all, because that's not our job. I would favor, because you want input, on the second alternative. I don't favor putting all the cost on the developer and the residents in that area. I think the middle alternative, or I'd go with the third alternative because they're in the ballpark. I think that's a fair way to allocate those. But again, I'm not weighing, I don't think we're recommending that by endorsing the second or third alternative, we're not saying that that's the right solution to put that fire station at that development. But if it is going to happen, our recommendation would use the second or third alternative. So I throw those out there as thoughts, and I could propose, for instance, a friendly amendment to your motion, but if folks don't like that, we'll just keep with what you have.
Would anyone like to see this amended?
Process question. You've got about
I know, I've got
12
quite a
there,
few.
we're not gonna make it. I wonder if you could read your list, and anybody who has objections to anything on your list, we talk about that, and then make one big motion for what's left.
Okay, sure.
If we do them one by one.
It might take a while. That's a good idea. So the first one was just an additional analysis of relocating the fire station or removing a fire station, and just for city council's awareness. And then the other piece would be to do a sensitivity analysis around other assumptions like home prices. I don't know if there were a few others that were mentioned. Okay.
So I'll comment on that, and we're going to comment as you go along. So by that you mean you want sensitivity analysis, you want confidence levels of the results, you want other ranges associated with it? So just throw out, so I'm not being coy. I agree with what I heard from the consultant, that these are reasonable assumptions. And you want more.
I think I would defer to the expert in the room, but additional sensitivity analysis would be maybe helpful to present to city council.
What does that mean?
Not just numbers, but understanding what is this model sensitive to, both sensitive to. If we talked about salaries, you think that's something that would be very sensitive to? I don't know. We talked about some other things that the sensitivity was, like the difference between option 2 and option 3 on the fire station was not very sensitive. Just to understand where this thing could go right and where it could go wrong. I don't think we need 17 charts. I think we need a conversation of what this project might look like, other than sort of on average, we think it's going to go right. We know it's not going to go right. No, none of these projects for 15 years go right. Okay, that doesn't mean don't do them, but open your eyes to what the possibilities are of where this thing could go wrong.
Yeah.
So, so my summary of that, the answer to that would be, we heard from, on the assumptions on the revenue side, the property values is the biggest variable, and on the cost side, it's that variable rate. And if that information is, I'm sorry, if the property values is the biggest variable on the revenue side, and on the cost side, it's that variable rate. And if you are saying you want to look at, point that out to the council and others, I think that's useful to me, so I would support that. And I wanted to kind of add to your point, Mitchell, though this all then lands to what I think is the key piece of this, always is what's the judgment at the end in terms of net cost impact on the city, if any, net negative, neutral, maybe as you were suggesting, maybe net positive. And what I would like to see this, because we've gone through this before, whatever the city concludes on this, so this will be so important for the voters to see if this goes that far. They want to know, is there going to be an impact? And what I would want to put on the table is an explanation of the reliability of those conclusions, because this model, so the theory on models, all models are wrong, but some are useful, right? And the question for this is, how useful is it? And I think whatever number comes up, or whatever that conclusion is, that needs to be explained in a proper way to show that the confidence level for this is pretty low. There's all these variables that could happen in decision-making by council, but this is the best we have now. But it's not something that maybe will be the ultimate driver on the project. You can't say, well, this project is a net positive and take that to the bank. So what I'm aiming for is a staff report or that kind of explanation, because that's what's going to be talked about for this project. And it wasn't in the staff report. It didn't have that kind of uncertainty in it. So that's what I'd like to see.
Madam Chair, one of the items I'd like to maybe bring up as part of the discussion you just talked about. So some of the key assumptions were listed as part of the staff report. So for example, are you okay with the inflation assumptions? Do you want it higher or lower? Because that's going to drive, the model as well. So we would like to get, if you're okay with those, then that's fine. One of the other ones you've discussed is home prices, like the value, what's the selling price? Well, you say, can we do sensitivity analysis? Do you want it to be 10% lower, 10% higher? So if you could provide maybe some guidance as to what you're looking for. So when you say home prices sensitivity analysis, what does that mean? Is current one too high, too low? Where do you want us to go?
I think what I'm envisioning, just conceptually, is like take the home price assumption variable and the fixed cost ratio and just push them both in an unfavorable direction. And then push them both in a favorable direction and just see what happens. I mean, I frankly don't know that we're really in a position to say, take 100 basis points off, take 150, something. What happens if home prices don't go up? What happens if they go up more than expected? But yeah, whether it's 100 basis points or 50, I don't know.
So otherwise the commission is pretty much delegating that determination, how much you want on the sensitivity analysis to the staff and the consultant to figure out, okay, to the good, is it 10% or is it 5%?
Well, if you want to send me the model, I'll go. If that's, let's just get to that and, we'll run some cases. And I'm serious, we can do a whole bunch and distribute them and whatever, comply with
Madam Chair,
the Brand Act.
I'm comfortable with everything in the motion, but I've got to go.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think we need, I leave it to the consultant to decide how far he should push them. My issue is, and I agree with you, is if we push them, what happens? Okay, what is the sensitivity? Where is this most at risk? Okay, under what kind of scenarios? And it's scenarios that's really important. It's not whether it's break even or break even plus 1%. We're looking at this, it's sort of break even. Okay, I don't think we're going to knock it off that terribly, but unless we're building a fire station. But I think to understand where things have to be, where they need to be sensitive to is really important.
I think to Steve's point, the way that I thought about it is more in a recession or a recessionary environment, what does that look like? And then when, things are going really well, what does that look like for Davis specifically? Or even just comparable sized places, because this is obviously a very new development for Davis. And so my thought was that it would be more on that basis, if you're, as opposed to maybe percentages or something. I don't know if folks have anything to add to that. Or if you have anything to add about the challenges of doing something like that.
I think I understand what you're all grappling with, and I think what I'm hearing is that you want to inform the city council about the fact that it is uncertain exactly how this plays out over 15 years, and that it would be helpful if we provided some information along the lines of, if home prices were to be decreased by a certain percentage, how much does that change the results of this? If we change that cost variability factor for the applicable services, how much does that change the results? I think we could probably pick some reasonable amounts to vary those assumptions and then provide some information about, how that then affects the bottom line, that fiscal balance there. So a range of factors, the home prices, the cost variability, looking at what happens if we were to say, no, a fourth fire station doesn't get built and we're just going to allocate the project a share of its costs for the 3 stations along with all the rest of the city. So we could put together some different mini scenarios, if you will, and say this is how it changes things, to provide that information to council so they can understand if they're trying to grapple with it themselves. Well, how would this change if some element of the project changed? Know the directionality of that, not necessarily the specific number, but roughly how much is that going to move the needle in which direction?
I think the one other area that we talked about with sensitivity, and it's probably the most difficult because it's not just a number in your model, is this sequencing. If sequencing gets out of whack, what can that do?
And I think, Elena, you also mentioned some of the assumptions that are already in here, like around inflation and around personnel costs, or, the things that are included. And I think right now there are a lot of vacancies with the city, and I know that creates some savings that can be maybe put towards other things. And I wonder if like a fully staffed city that pays its employees market rate would change some of these assumptions. I don't know.
I think that 4% inflation factor for personnel costs was meant to capture at least some of what you're talking about.
Got it, thank you. Okay, well then, I don't know. But yeah, so I think you really phrased it very wonderfully, much better than I did. And but just a sensitivity analysis just to provide some information about how some of these assumptions might change or be impacted by macro factors or anything like that would be, I think, a recommendation that we have to put for consideration by the City Council. And then the other recommendations that we've discussed here, okay. The other recommendations that we have here might not necessarily be related to financial assumptions. Now that I'm looking at them, they seem to be more related, like potentially talking to the school districts to negotiate a better split of taxes. That doesn't necessarily have to do with an assumption. I wonder if that's something that we could just recommend for consideration.
We can certainly try. I do not believe that state will negotiate. I mean, it is very unlikely.
To the list of recommendations from this commission.
Certainly,
for consideration.
I don't believe the state will be willing to give up the shares, so they will have to fill up the difference for schools out of general fund. Because they have to put in a certain dollar amount, and so I don't think they'd be willing to say, yes, school, you can give it up so we can make it up for you.
Okay, I appreciated Darian's optimism, but that is a long-standing legislative fix that happened many years ago, that whole process. So I don't think that's really a viable recommendation.
Okay, so if it's non-starter, then maybe we'll leave that one. But then the other recommendation, which maybe isn't a change to an assumption, but just assure that, or think about approving bonding only when there's kind of assumption that, the development would move forward and that there's all the necessary criteria in place, whatever that may be, by City Council. That's something that I think I've heard as just something to recommend from this commission to city council as they consider the development. Unless there's an issue with that.
We certainly can do that. This is more on the capital cost, and this would be likely a negotiation with the developer in setting up the development agreement, what they're responsible for and how it's paid for. So it can certainly be taken into consideration, but I think the fiscal analysis was related specifically to operating costs, ongoing operating costs that general fund would have to pay for otherwise.
Well, I think we would still be interested in just saying that that's something that
I still remain, you can't look at one without the other and get a clear picture of what's going on. You gotta look at both the capital and independent of who's paying for it.
So maybe I can raise one of the points I want to make now, because it piggybacks on what you're suggesting. So or I believe you're suggesting. So the challenge with this whole conversation is we have an EIR, we have a proposed project, but we're still early in the process. We don't have the development agreement. We don't have a proposal yet on these funding mechanisms for open and natural spaces. We have ideas, but not, to me, a lot of analysis as to the merits of those. So I have a process suggestion for the commission and also for the city. The process suggestion would be is that there would be a subcommittee of this commission. I know it'd have to go through the council, but with the new process. But that subcommittee would be responsible for tracking this project as it moves forward. And if the city council approves it and puts it on the ballot, then this commission would be able to track and see exactly what it looks like at that final stage. And then, assuming it gets that far, there'd be another opportunity for this commission to weigh in on the financial neutrality. I'd leave it at that. But you'd have a development agreement, you'd have a more defined project, you know at that point what the funding mechanisms are for the open natural space, open and natural spaces, and could take another look at it. So if it goes up for a vote in November or sometime before that, this has been a problem in the past. And it's not just this project. To be able to give thoughtful comments for a project that's still early in the stage, you gotta have it done at some point, but it hasn't been completely defined. So that'd be my suggestion, that the commission stay engaged. I would propose through a subcommittee, but if there's not an interest in that, I still think it should come back through to the commission again after the project becomes mature. So that'd be my thought, and the subcommittee could take a look at these different funding sources.
For a subcommittee, I think the new process is that there's a memo that's created and then provided to city council to see if this is something that they have interest in us exploring. And so I think that that's a good suggestion. And
yeah, that's how I understand the process. I'm teeing it up for this group. If this group thought that had some merit, then we could vote on that and see what the council, whether they want us to continue. That if they say yes, then there we are. If they say no, then there we are. We're not doing that. And the other part of it, though, even if there isn't a subcommittee, I still think it should come back to this commission to take a fresh look. We may not need the consultant this time, say, you've done your job, appreciate that. But have a better idea what that project looks like after you see the development agreement and the funding sources for the open and natural spaces. So that'd be my recommendation, one more look at it. And I think from a policy standpoint in the city as a whole, that's really important. I mean, this is a big project, really important to the city, and I think we owe it to the voters to have, if it gets that far, to take the best look we can at the final mature project. So that'd be my thought.
So are you just looking to see if folks would be interested in someone putting
Yeah,
together?
I'm asking this group, if this group says no, then it dies. I mean, I can make a motion, but,
I don't know that we, maybe just general interest would mean that somebody could prepare a memo that goes to city council so they can take a look at that as a potential project for consideration.
So you would need a motion, you would under the new process, you would, that's generally always been the practice. If you want to undertake some new work from a new subcommittee, you would need a motion, majority approval, and it sounds like Commissioner Sandino kind of has two slightly distinct motions he may want to make.
Okay, so can we table those till we get through?
Yeah,
this
yeah,
and
that's
then
fine,
come back?
but I thought it fit in with your comment, so that's why I threw it out there.
Okay, and then I think the other pieces were also not necessarily assumptions, but just a recommendation that city council look at requiring that funding mechanisms be kind of fully structured or before kind of moving forward with approval project. But I don't think that we had any particular discussion around the different funding mechanisms like the CDF versus the trust or the other option. And I think, Mitchell, you had a suggestion that that there just be further analysis related to whether or not these are by nature break even, or if there's some sort of, if there's financial liability in the future, maybe is there a plan for a cushion? Right.
Yeah, to generally consider whether this style of development, which is like routinely just to break even, whether we should be considering an alternative such as something that has higher density, something that could be revenue positive. So that could look like something that's higher density or something that has more mixed use with something other than a residential component, or a larger portion of a non-residential component that could be possibly revenue positive.
And then just on some of the like the hazardous waste or chemicals or that sort of thing, just how does that feed into assumptions if the city would have to take on any sort of cost related to that later on? Those were all of them to my mind, that those be explored.
I make a motion to formalize your list.
Sure.
All right, I move that we take your list and move it on to the city council.
Is there a second?
I second.
Okay, anyone opposed?
I'm not opposed, but I don't like on voting stuff I'm not clear on, so go through the list and then I can, if not, I'll abstain, just to move it on. Is that better?
Can you
Okay,
articulate
so let's move on.
the full
Go ahead.
motion? Sorry, can you articulate the full motion with your list
Okay,
as a start?
okay, so full motion with my list would be an analysis of just alternative options such as, like we mentioned, like we had a lot of discussion around relocation of fire stations or potentially not of fire station, just an analysis of that option. Sensitivity analysis, including additional scenarios of metrics like recessionary housing costs. I think we listed a few here. Beyond that, sorry, I'm just trying to reach it through here, but what could be the cost to the city related to having to deal with hazardous waste in the future, and that as an assumption that could be analyzed. And then are there, Mitchell, I'm sorry, could you give me yours again? Which was just...
Yeah, I just wanted the city council to consider if this development should be, if they should consider revising this development or considering some changes to the development that would make it potentially to have a positive revenue effect on the city budget. So, and I just gave suggestions that some possibilities, and it's not my area of expertise, but it could be that adding higher density housing or having mixed use development or other alternatives.
So alternatives around density, and then the other pieces would be to take a look just in terms of requiring funding mechanisms that are fully structured around the open and natural spaces before moving forward, and kind of thinking about bonding really when, you know, they have more information, that an assurance that the development kind of meets various assumptions. That would be the list.
That was a motion, right?
Yes. And so I moved that list.
I second.
Okay.
I understand it's, are we voting or?
Yes.
Okay.
And so Mitchell, I moved it, Mitchell seconded. I'm asking if there's anyone who's in opposition.
Everyone is for or abstaining?
And abstentions would be Darian, he's not here right now, I imagine, or,
Well, he recorded the vote before he left, but I'm not sure that he recorded, the vote he attempted to record is aligned with what you just said. I'm not sure if it's been modified, and we'd have to go back and look at the tape, but he did attempt to record the vote before he left the room. I know you don't have a protocol on that, but that's kind of often a common practice.
okay.
Not present.
Well, no, it is a practice to record a vote before you leave a room and you get present for the deliberations, but
Okay, well, I think some of the pieces that we did discuss, he agreed with, and I don't know how to deal with that, I guess.
we'll worry about it on the tape.
Okay.
Why don't you proceed and we'll worry about that.
And so I didn't hear anyone opposed, so with that, the motion carries to include these recommendations that were listed to City Council.
Yeah, I want to make my motion then. So my motion is that this commission make a recommendation to the council that a subcommittee be formed to track only the fiscal developments of this project if and when it moves forward, including issues relating to the funding of the open and natural spaces, and an evaluation of a development agreement if it's completed, and then an evaluation of the ultimate question again, whether this project is neutral or even better on terms of city financing, and if we get the direction from the council to form that, then we'd be able to track this project more closely through a subcommittee, which would allow more open questions and consulting, etc. So that'd be my motion. So if we get a second, we get the vote.
Second.
Got a second.
Is there anyone opposed? I guess that motion carries.
Okay, thank you.
Do you do that?
And I make up a backup motion, just in case the council turns this down. My backup motion is that, second motion, well, regardless of what the council does, I'd like to have this issue come back to the fiscal commission. Again, I don't have the exact date, but once we have a mature project, we wouldn't have this kind of conversation. It would be just an update as to what happens after the development agreement, these funding sources. And I would like to invite, second on that, I think if that happens, this will let staff and council know that we'd still like to see this again.
So do you have an update related to?
Yes, that there would be another agendized item on the fiscal commission's agenda. Don't have an exact date, but once we have a mature project, we would take another look at it. Maybe we have some new thoughts and updates, but again, the project is so important, it should come back again one more time to look at it.
I'll second.
Is anyone opposed?
I don't think we need, at this point in time, I don't think we need two. I think give us an opportunity to work with this, and as we work with it, develop a more specific need and add.
So let me make my case for that. The case is the lack of a development agreement right now. All we have is an EIR, and we'd be able to have a better understanding as to where this actually lands, the types of units, the types of public benefits, the types of funding of those three options. So I would say if we get approval from the council to have the subcommittee, then it's not as important because the subcommittee could do that. So maybe we could wait. I could live with that. Would that be okay with you? To wait until we see what? Okay, then I withdraw my motion just to move it on.
I think on this piece, we can move on to it. Well, we're a little past time now, so past 8. And I think we would have to vote to continue the meeting. It is pretty late though. So I don't know how many folks kind of want to get home tonight or the ability to stay. The mid-year budget update, I think, was already presented to City Council yesterday, so this is just informational, is what I understand. Can I just get a quick idea of if folks want to stay keep going for this presentation, or kind of call it a
Have to get really,
okay.
but that is the word.
Well, I mean, we could still have quorum to continue, just want to get a sense.
Sorry.
I think we would still have quorum to
Yeah.
continue.
So you just need a motion if you want to continue, and if someone seconds it, you vote, and if it fails, then you don't continue.
So, I'll just make a motion to continue with the mid-year budget update. Can I get a second? Anyone opposed?
I'm not seeing a second, so that would mean the motion would fail.
Oh, I think,
I didn't see you second, I didn't hear you.
oh, Leslie second.
Leslie seconded. Apologize, I didn't see you. So then you call for a vote and see if there's a majority to agreeing to stay.
Well, Madam, just yes or no? Okay.
Sorry.
Would you just like to vote yes or no on this one?
You're voting on the motion to whether you want to stay. If you vote yes, that means you want to continue the meeting past the hour. If no, then you'd like it to end.
No pressure.
Can I ask,
If I vote no, it's not going to prevent you from, okay, then I can be any ill will. I just want to make sure I stay.
Okay, so that's a no from you.
Okay.
And, David?
So I'm going to vote yes, but I'm also anticipating that this is a 15-minute item, or maybe half an hour at the most, but I'm willing to go longer, but I'm just, I don't think this is, excuse me, the same kind of level of discussion that we've already had.
Yeah.
So.
But if I leave, it's not going to prevent you from getting in the subcommittee of it too.
And then, so yes or no from David? Yes or no?
I'm sorry.
Yes. Yes
Oh,
or
I'm
no?
yes. I'm yes to go longer. I'm sorry. I thought I said yes.
Yes, okay. Yes, okay. Well, then I suppose we'll just continue the meeting. With the fiscal year, mid-year budget updates, and I'll just take that comment if there, or motion carries, because I didn't hear.
Are we on the next item?
Yes, I think so. There's something else I was supposed to do in between?
Great. So we're moving on to, so let me set it up so that I can actually get it going.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Elena, it can also be like a shorter update than maybe you were anticipating, just because it was presented to City Council yesterday, and so we can also potentially do questions.
will do my best.
All right, so fiscal year 24-25 mid-year budget update. I'll start with the general fund summary. So a few takeaways from here is, the first column you see is the adopted budget. This is what council approved a year ago in June 2024. Revised budget is our current projection where general fund will end the fiscal year. It does include the proposed adjustments that were presented to council and approved at this point. The detail of adjustments, if you wanted to see them, is included in the attachment 4A and provides full information breakdown. I'll also go through the adjustments real quickly if you would like later on in the presentation as well. Our revenues are tracking as we expected, our tax and fee revenues. I will say that in the projection, we currently include 1 quarter worth of the locally approved additional 1% tax that went in effect yesterday. In terms of expenditures, when we looked at it, we do expect it to track as expected, with exception of one particular one, which is water and irrigation charges. So those are a little greater, and so they're being increased by $1.4 million. I do want to point out that at the time a year ago when the budget was adopted, we didn't know if the revenue measure was going to be approved, and so we expected the general fund to end fiscal year 25 with 7.5% in reserves. With the addition of this one new local sales tax, we expect the general fund to end with 9.9%. So the entire amount right now is being added to the reserves. I think it's important to remind everybody that the City Council policy for the reserve is 15%. So with that, we're still below, but at least we're on the right track to actually increase the reserves and continue hopefully increasing the reserves.
Before you move on, can you, I'm trying to understand, so when I look at the adopted budget and the revised budget, are they for a year end?
Yes, and projection through the year, so this assumes full year.
So year-to-date actual though is actual, right? It's not actual plus plan, right?
Correct, that's actual what was collected through December 2024.
So how do I know I'm on track? Because I don't have a plan for half a year.
So if you, so in a staff report, we usually provide some details as to, for example, when property tax is collected. So by now, we know what the property tax will be because the assessor sets property tax values as of January 1. So we know property taxes. Unfortunately, we don't receive property taxes until January. So by now, we already have half of the property tax. You don't see it here because it's not actually received in December. So as an example, we know what the property tax is. We, at this point, only know what the sales tax actual receipts were through December, but our consultants also provide us with projections. We work with sales tax consultant who gives us a projection through the end of the year, and so they tell us if we are on track or not on track, so if it goes above or below. So we'll get into more detail on some of the major revenue sources as we go along.
At a high level, the expenditures, the revised budget are 90 million.
Correct.
We've spent 37 to date. How do I know, is that a good thing, or should that number be even lower? Is there seasonality to these numbers? Again, I look at an exhibit like this and I don't know how to react.
So in terms of expenditures, yes. So payroll happens every 2 weeks.
So that's consistent, right? We make an assumption that services and supplies will be spent. There is some adjustments to if departments do a purchase order for that usually covers a full year, so they encumber the full amount at the beginning of the year. So our expectation is that they will be spending a dollar amount. There were some services and supplies that's been reviewed by the departments, and they make an adjustment to say, okay, we think it's going to be lower. So as part of the list of adjustments that are in attachment 4, we do decrease some of the expenditures that are within general fund. So we look at what the labor costs are, we look at what the services and supplies are, and that kind of gives us the information about the expenditures when we do the review. What you also see in here, so revised budget, for example, went up to $90 million. Well, it included, under release or use of fund balance, you will see $4.2 million. So last year, fiscal year 24 in this case, departments did not necessarily spend full budgeted amount, but they've encumbered it, and it rolled in the form of a purchase order into the new budget. So it's been released of fund balance. Last year, we expected it not to be part of the fund balance, but it became it because it wasn't spent. So that's why it's being added in this case. Hopefully that makes sense. So that goes towards our fund balance, and that goes into the calculation. There's no real need to do a calculation for the fund balance reserve for year-to-date actual, because it's not really relevant. Part of the reason is, we're looking at 6 months, but based on the timing, we haven't received certain revenues. But when we look at the full fiscal year, we're looking at full 12 months of, let's say, sales tax receipts. We may only have 3 recorded, but we look at full 12 months, which is why we present what is the revised budget, which is our expectation, how we're going to end the fiscal year. So there's timing, there's seasonality of expenses and revenues. And so when you look, as an example, business licenses, we bill for those, and they're collected once a year between usually December, January timeframe. A lot of it comes in January because people make a payment for the business license, and we collect majority of it. It's not reflected as of December. Is that answering your question? All right. So moving on to the general fund, this gives you a breakdown of the revenues within general fund, and I would call it more of a major revenue sources. So property tax and sales tax are the top 2. Generally, property tax and motor vehicles and lieu tax, they're combined, and we usually call them as property taxes because they are collected as part of a property tax from property tax dollars. In combination, our property tax then is still the top revenue. However, if we segregate the motor vehicle and lieu revenue in its own line, we actually have where sales tax is now exceeding as a revenue source than the regular, call it secured and unsecured property taxes. So this is again, the reasoning for that again is because we have that additional 1% that the voters voted for to include. The little blue call out here gives you a little bit of breakdown what the other taxes are, which includes the transient occupancy tax, business licenses, cannabis, franchise fee, real property tax. Other revenues are all of the charges for services the city charges. So it includes park fees for the recreation programs. It includes fees and charges for permitting, whether it's planning, whether it's engineering, things like that. So going through a little more detail on the property tax revenues. So we actually proposed to council and they approved to increase property tax revenues by $1 million. So it's coming in greater than we originally thought. Mainly because the citywide assessed value growth from prior year was 4%, so it increased more than we expected. The 2 major components why it went up was the 2% CPI increase for the assessed values, which is the top, the cap for Prop 13. And the second one is the transfer, last year's transfer of ownership. Remember that property taxes, the assessed values are set as of January 1. So any change in ownership that occurred would be looking at the last calendar year. So here's the view of what we call sales, use, and transactions tax. So the blue portion that you will see is the Bradley Burns 1%. That sales tax has gone up in '22 and was the highest, and since then it declined. So our consultants seen it not only within the city of Davis, but kind of across the state at this point. The green represents our local sales tax. So up to April 1st, as of yesterday, this was 1%, and effective April 1, it's now 2%. That's part of the reason why you see such an increase, because there's an extra 1% for a quarter. Business license tax, as we looked at it, so